But what gets more exciting is when you start looking at how this notion of frugality can extend to the domain of science, the ultimate frontier, so to speak. And even in science, you begin to see the notion of frugal innovation gaining traction. This is a mission sent by NASA that entered the Mars orbit in last September 2014. The satellite was developed at the cost of $700 million. It took NASA 5 years to set up this system. A few days earlier than that, India's own space mission entered the Mars orbit. It's called Mangalian, except that this project was conducted for a budget of $75 million. To give you a reference point, the movie Gravity with George Clooney cost about $100 million. So while Clooney is actually exploring in a fictional movie, space, Indians have done it in reality at 25% less cost. And the way they did that is essentially instead of building physical prototypes, which is very expensive, they use what is abundant in India, which is software capabilities. So you do a lot of simulation work in computer, virtually, instead of building physical prototypes. So this is called frugal science. We'll talk about that later. This is going to be really exciting because if some of you have a scientific temperament, same as engineering, because engineering science are in a way complementary, this is going to be a very exciting field as well to look at how to apply some of the emerging technology blocks to push the boundaries of scientific knowledge as well. So the big lesson we learned from emerging markets is essentially this idea that always look at the glass half full, never half empty, right? So that means always look at what you have as resource to address what you don't have, right? Instead of going for what you don't have, take advantage of the gifts and skills and resources you already have and leverage that to deal with what you don't have. So that's the kind of big lesson we learned from emerging markets. And that's why the frugality, the notion of frugal is essentially to say, start with what you have. Don't try to reinvent the wheel. Start with what you have and then try to apply that to create more value. So that was the first book I published about 3 years ago called Jugaad Innovation. Jugaad is a Hindi word that means the MacGyver spirit. I don't know if you know MacGyver. Many of you are so young that I'm embarrassed to reveal my age by talking about MacGyver. But how many of you know about MacGyver, by the way? Okay, it's reassuring. But maybe in 10 years, I will look like an alien asking this question. So MacGyver was a famous TV action hero in the 80s. He's the anti-James Bond because he doesn't have fancy gadgets. He can pull himself from any difficult situation using a Swiss Army knife and duct tape. So it's this ability to improvise, clever solutions in difficult situations. So that's really what Jugaad means. So I wrote that book about 3 years ago, and then we begin to formalize the lessons learned from emerging markets with this concept of frugal innovation, which is essentially this kind of uncanny ability to do more with less. That means try to create more value using minimum resources. And the value essentially is for customers, of course, shareholders, if you're a publicly traded company, or investors, but also for society. That's very important. It's about how do you create more societal value, and for employees as well. And the resources, interestingly, apply to money. Capital is important, but also natural resources. Things like water, as you know, which is becoming very scarce, and then time. And the time would be, in a way, the lean startup idea, right? How do you kind of get things quickly in the marketplace by reducing time? So this is kind of what we conceptualize as frugal innovation is, how can companies essentially try to do both at the same time, which is not lose sight of the fact that value is really what matters, but creating more value, you can do that increasingly using fewer resources. There's a kind of a tension, between trying to maximize value while minimizing resources, which comes naturally in people living in emerging markets, but it's a bit harder for companies operating in, more abundant, economies. And that's really what I will be talking about now is give a lot of examples of entrepreneurs, companies who are trying to embody the spirit of doing more with less, not in emerging markets, but in mature economies like, United States, Europe, etc. So I want to begin with first kind of describing why there is a growing need in the first place to do more with less in the Western, economies. The first reason is because consumers are becoming more frugal. This is some research that shows that since the economic recession, people in US and Europe are looking for more discounts. They are willing to live with less. And this is actually a big phenomenon that actually started, I would say, even before 2008. And you know that today the middle class is feeling the squeeze. You heard about that, of course, in the news and reality you're living probably, you know, as well. And this is the first kind of message, is that consumers, even middle class consumers, are feeling the squeeze now, and they're looking for more value for the limited money they have. So they want to spend more judiciously the limited amount they have, you know, at their disposal.